Question I have is, how much of my transcendence or anybody's transcendence dependent upon grace versus personal and interest from, say, the separate self?
It's 100% grace.
100% they result, but does the personal
So
interest...
100% grace. The person does nothing.
Well, I agree. I mean, in my experience, my experiences that were super normal, put it that way, came when I never was looking for any of it.
Yes.
And now, by the way, I come and I try to cultivate this process, and that's not grace. That seems like it's more separate self saying, well, you need to do this or that.
No, let me explain just what I mean when I say it's 100% grace. When our essential nature is consciousness without limits, which is complete in itself. It knows no lack, and in its own experience of itself, it is ever present. So there is no fear of death or disappearance. So consciousness is knowing of its own being, is what's called happiness, fulfillment, peace. Now, when our own being seems to be veiled, and when the water seems to be confined inside the bottle, then our true nature is veiled, and the peace that is inherent in our true nature is veiled. Therefore, by definition, the finite consciousness, or the separate self, is a position of unhappiness, because its true nature of infinite consciousness seems to be missing or veiled. Therefore, the separate self, by definition, is seeking happiness. In fact, that's one way we could define the separate self, as the search for happiness. So the search from the point of view of the separate self, its search for happiness is something that it does. Because the separate self believes that it is a separate self, that can do things and desire things, and etc. In fact, there is no separate self. The seeking that the separate self feels that is its own desire is in fact the pull, the gravitational force of consciousness pulling the separate self back into itself. That's what grace is, the gravitational pull from happiness exerted on the illusory self. From the illusory self's point of view, that feels like the desire for happiness. It's not the desire for happiness, it's the pull from happiness that is being exerted on it. That is grace. So everything the separate self feels that it does or desires is not in fact the separate self doing anything. It is consciousness's own desire to be divested of its limitations. From the point of the view of the separate self, that feels like the desire, I want to be happy, or I want to be enlightened, or I must do such and such. And that's fine for the separate self to do that. But ultimately the separate self doesn't do anything. It's being reeled in by consciousness.
Or surprised by consciousness.
And sometimes it's surprised, but sometimes the separate self feels that it's walking towards consciousness. That's fine, just leave the separate self with that illusion. If the separate self feels that it's walking towards consciousness, that's fine, just keep walking. If it feels like you have to make an effort to meditate, then or to whatever it is, then make the effort. That's how it seems from the point of view of the finite self. The effort the separate self feels that it is making is in fact its response to consciousness reeling it in.
I just want to make sure that I gave the right question, and that is that some remarkable things happened quickly in my life, And I certainly wasn't looking for anything like that to happen. And since then, it's a very different kind of life. Of course, nothing will be the same.
Okay, but even this remarkable and unsolicited event, which was, as it were, a direct intervention of consciousness in the life of the apparently separate self, is no less grace than the subsequent efforts that the apparently separate self feels that it has to make in order to reclaim that experience.
I would agree with that, but I'm just saying that then to implement this idea that living a life based upon, say, the discipline of so many hours of meditation and so forth and so on, none of that preceded certain experiences that kind of locked me into doing the thing that I tend to do to seemingly support consciousness in the process of the continual evolution, say. And sometimes I wonder that, because it looks to me, not coming from your point of view, but from my limited point of view, which is all limited points of view, but it looks like some people are coming to join the party or to escape something when their approach to consciousness. It's almost like fashionable sometimes. And I don't know if those people make progress or not.
Say that again.
I don't know how their progress works.
No, but the bit before, I think I didn't
It's
understand.
kind of fashionable sometimes, particularly in this country, to be hip to the idea of say, yoga, for instance.
Yes, but that may be so. But everybody seeks happiness. All 7 billion of us seek happiness. The search for enlightenment is just the final furlong of the search for happiness. It's the same search. When most people seek happiness, they seek it through an object, or a substance, or a state, or a relationship. The search for enlightenment is just the same search for happiness, but having realized that no object, state, or relationship can give us what we want. It's the same search. Yes, the search for enlightenment is a refinement of the common search for happiness, but it's the same desire, it's the same force of attraction being exerted from the true self, which is happiness itself, on the separate self that most 7 billion people feel themselves to be. It's the same search. Now, if somebody thinks they're going to get happiness through yoga, through drugs, through whatever, the deep motive, it's not really yoga they want. If they thought that yoga would make them miserable, they wouldn't do yoga. In other words, they wouldn't do yoga. Nobody does yoga for its own sake. People do yoga for the happiness that they believe will be derived from it. People don't have intimate relationships for their own sake. They have intimate relationships for the happiness and the love they feel will be derived from it. That's, in other words, happiness is the only thing that people desire for its own sake. Nothing else is desired for its own sake. Everything else is desired for the happiness that we believe will be derived from it. And in other words, everybody is only seeking happiness. There are two possibilities in life, either to seek happiness or to be happy. That's it. Those are the possibilities. And if we're not happy, then whether we realize it or not, we are seeking happiness. Every waking hour, we are seeking happiness. That is the motive behind all our actions, all our thinking, feeling, everything. Everyone's engaged in the same search. What we're speaking of here is a very refined form of that search, because we have understood that no object, nothing in the realm of the body-mind world can deliver happiness.
Well stated, as I expected. and I agree. But it's just odd how it all happens in the play, the way it unfolds.
It's different for different people.
Yeah.
Some people, they have some realization or opening or awakening completely unsolicited, without any prior interest in these matters. Some people have to become suicidally depressed before they, and hit rock bottom before there is a kind of surrender and an opening up. And some people don't suffer deeply. Everyone suffers to a certain extent, but some people don't have to suffer deeply before the question arises in their mind: what is the purpose of life? Where can happiness be found? What am I truly? And then they begin to ponder and explore their experience. It can happen in so many ways. And all of those ways are grace, because the search for happiness is in fact not a search for happiness, it's a pull from happiness. Everybody feels this pull from happiness. All 7 billion of us.
Have you met people who seem to be attached to pain and unhappiness?
They're only attached to pain because they believe it will make them happy.
That's a stretch, but I'll accept it.
No, but sometimes people think that suffering is a virtue, but they only suffer because ultimately they think it'll bring them happiness. The only reason people desire God is because they believe that when they find God, it will bring them happiness. Who would search for God if they thought it would, the finding of God would make them miserable? Nobody. The search for happiness is higher than the search for God. If any of us thought that enlightenment would make us miserable, would anyone seek enlightenment? I wouldn't. No, why do we seek enlightenment? Because we've tried everything else, nothing else made us happy. Enlightenment is the last option. It's not enlightenment that people seek, it's happiness. Happiness is the highest desire. It's the purpose of human life. And because it's the purpose of human life, it's what people desire above all else. Peace or happiness or love, they're synonymous in this context.